We are excited to announce the launch of a new educational initiative at Gifts of Life Ministries, the Education for Public Engagement, EPE Ministry. This program is designed to empower our church family and the broader community with essential knowledge, valuable resources, and a strong faith-based framework. Our goal is to foster informed, compassionate, and proactive engagement in civic life. Part of our EPE ministry is the Power to the People series. This series of lectures, workshops, seminars, and discussions will provide tools and insights that encourage critical thinking and active participation in local and national issues. By equipping individuals with the necessary skills and understanding, we can inspire meaningful conversations and actions that reflect our faith values in the public sphere. Ultimately, our goal is to cultivate a society that is not only more equitable but also rooted in justice, where the values of compassion, service, and integrity guide decision-making at every level. This commitment to living out one's beliefs in both the personal and public spheres can have a transformative impact on the broader community and help establish a foundation for a more just and harmonious society.
I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Thank you for joining us for our final Under the Blacklight event of 2025, a year that has tested our fragile multiracial democracy like no other in our lifetimes. But we're still here, we're still fighting, and we're still committed to calling out and challenging those who are turning the clock back on racial justice. As part of that commitment, and in advance of our conversation this evening, we're delighted to announce AAPF's latest report, Anti-Blackness Is the Point: Racism, Misogyny, and Donald Trump's Assault on Equal Opportunity. Across the country, we see anti-Blackness shaping the language used to purge leadership in crucial public institutions, leading to the dismantlement of the federal government and imposing limits on what we're allowed to remember about our own history. But don't misunderstand. Taking anti-Blackness seriously doesn't just mean that only Black people are suffering, nor does it assert that addressing anti-Blackness alone will resolve every challenge facing our democracy. Rather, it is a claim that anti-Blackness has been the underbrush that allowed a raging fire to burn through the norms of our entire democracy so viciously and so quickly. Yet political and media elites rarely acknowledge the contours of anti-Blackness. They often sidestep race and anti-Blackness in favor of a simplified class analysis or pro-democracy focus. That silence distorts what people need to understand about the roots of the current crisis. Right now, we are seeing this distortion play out in real time with how folks ignore the link between anti-Blackness and the administration's anti-immigrant agenda. Xenophobia is the common explanation for ISIS outrages, but is it really all there is? How can that be when so many of the most vitriolic statements made about immigrants are about those from Somalia, whom Trump recently referred to as garbage in his rant against Ilhan Omar? Recall, too, that during the election, he insisted that Haitians were eating dogs and cats in Springfield? Or is it merely a coincidence that the only refugees worthy of protection are white South Africans still angry about the fall of apartheid? Surely not. Failing to connect the dots means that we will fail to understand how anti-Blackness is a central organizing force in our political life and how it enables the rise of authoritarianism. Our report identifies 4 ways that this strategy is being deployed and how anti-Blackness is being articulated at this moment. So first, the narrative and substantive attacks on Black people, especially Black people in positions of authority, and frequently Black women. Second, the coordinated rollback of racial inclusion efforts in the public and in the private sector. Third, the association of the federal civil service with anti-Black tropes, bloated, inefficient, and importantly, serving the wrong interests and the wrong people. And fourth, the assault on Black history and historical memory by characterizing the artifacts as part of an improper ideology. Together, they chart the architecture of a strategy that threatens our multiracial democracy. So let me briefly describe these dimensions, and then I'll turn to our panelists to deepen the discussion. Our goal is to devise a path forward. Now, keep in mind, you can access copies of the report by scanning the QR code shown here or by visiting AAPF's website. So element 1, the attack on Black women in leadership. The first dimension of anti-Blackness that we explore in the report is the normalization of racist rhetoric aimed at Black folks in leadership, particularly aimed at Black women. And so Vice President Kamala Harris is called a low IQ person or lazy. We're told that Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson should have to release her LSAT scores because she's presumed unqualified to have attended Harvard Law, let alone to have been nominated and confirmed to the nation's highest court. All of this fits with the mentality of administration official Darren Beattie, who has said that, quote, competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work. This is how DEI is blamed for every public crisis, from train derailments and bridge failures to bank collapses, wildfires, and airplane disasters. All have been recently blamed on diversity, despite no effort that any of these things were connected to any of those efforts or to Black folks at all. The attempt to link disasters to DEI rests on longstanding stereotypes against Black people and Black women in particular. This embodiment of anti-Blackness prompts the imperative to restore a natural racial and gender hierarchy so that many of the right can feel that removing diversity, equity, and inclusion is simply righting the ship. The second example of anti-Blackness discussed in the report is the coordinated effort to undermine equal opportunity across public and private institutions. We see this in the repeal of longstanding rules in place for over 6 decades that require government contractors to take active steps toward fair treatment and to remove barriers to racial equity. The Department of Justice has redirected its focus to claims of anti-white bias. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has scuttled enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. And the Department of Education has dismissed or paused over 10,000 pending discrimination complaints. At the same time, intimidated by government threats, corporations, universities, and nonprofits are scaling back equity programs. Thousands of DEI roles have been cut, and initiatives that once supported access inclusion for everybody are being dismantled. Example 3, the dismantling of the federal civil service. So the third dimension of the regime's anti-Blackness involves the dismantling of one of the key pipelines to economic security for Black people, the federal civil service. An understanding of American history reveals the essential role that the federal government played in improving Black Americans' economic mobility. Therefore, the dislike or hostility directed at the federal government is commonly traceable to feelings of anti-Black racism. Since Brown versus Board of Education, the federal government's role in promoting equality and other democratic values has been vulnerable to its association with integration. Now, Trump 2.0 further weaponizes that association And by taking a chainsaw to the civil service sector, it is one of the key ways in which our entire federal bureaucracy is being dismantled. This is a version of how the attack on the welfare queen was used to dismantle the social safety net. So anti-Blackness is then marshaled to harm everyone else. But let's be clear, the face of these attacks is often most readily Black people, Black women in particular. More than 300,000 Black women lost their jobs between January and August of 2025. This is a bloodbath of monumental proportions. And this happens at the same time that white men and women saw increases in employment, a collapse driven by the assault on DEI-related positions, as well as by massive cuts to the federal government. Lastly, the assault on history. The foundational premise of anti-Blackness, that whites are the biological superior race and that Black people are naturally inferior, is precisely what the Trump administration relies on when it categorizes Black history, Black artifacts, Black authors, Black frameworks as improper ideology. When states remove texts about slavery or racial violence, they protect the conditions that allow discrimination to grow. When we remove exhibits and narratives from museums, we paper over the horrors of our past, and we eradicate our ability to learn from the movements that challenge them. When we cave to efforts to whitewash our history, the history of enslavement, Jim Crow, systemic racism, as if they never happened, or at the very least had only been minor parts of our story, then we are in danger of repeating it. Despite how obvious the role of anti-Blackness is to this moment, many still fail to name it as a crucial animating force in the current crisis. And by not naming it, we allow its practitioners the plausible deniability of phony colorblindness, which in turn adds fuel to the flame that is engulfing our democracy. So here, in this conversation, we want to explore how anti-Blackness has misshaped our political system. Importantly, we want to explore how it operates, not solely through the actions of some, but through the permission given, the inaction of others. To help us grapple with this and to understand it historically, because again, none of this is new, I'm joined by amazing thinkers who just happen to be some of my friends. First, we have Kienga Yamada Taylor, the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton. She is the author of Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership, a semi-finalist for the National Book Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. A MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellow, she was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the United States by The Root. Next, we're joined by Eddie Glaude Jr., the James S. McDowell Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton. He is the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. And most recently, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. The book has been called a politically astute, lyrical meditation on how ordinary people can assume responsibility for what it takes to achieve a more just and perfect democracy. And finally, Tim Wise joins us. He is a senior fellow here at AAPF, and he's one of the nation's most prominent white anti-racist essayists and educators. Earlier this year, he was named the most banned author at the Naval Academy, thanks to the fragility of our Secretary of War. He is the author of 9 books, including White Like Me, Reflections from a Privileged Son, and Between Barack and a Hard Place, Racism and White Denial in the Age of Obama, which were 2 of his 4 banned books at Annapolis. Before we dive in, I want to make a mention of Say Her Name, Our campaign to bring visibility and justice to Black women, girls, and femmes taken by police violence. Next Monday, December 8th in New York City, AAPF will host our 10th anniversary commemoration, Bridges and Gatherings, an evening of art, memory, and community. What promises to be a spectacular evening hosted by Tony Award-winning actor Kara Young. Check it out and register by scanning the QR code on your screen. We'll share a little bit more about it later. So now, let's get going. We know that anti-Blackness is not something which is exclusive to one side of the political aisle. We know from history that anti-Blackness permeates the political spectrum from left to right. We saw how quickly Northern Republicans capitulated to Southern Democrats to end Reconstruction, sacrificing Black people to racial tyranny for nearly a century. So bringing that dynamic into the contemporary moment, we want to sketch examples of how anti-Blackness shows up across the political spectrum today. So Eddie, I want to come to you first. We had a conversation a few weeks ago in which we talked about how anti-Blackness is playing out in both the political and media arenas. For example, coverage of the elections in New York, Virginia, and New Jersey last month largely papered over the determinative role that Black voters played in key electoral victories. Mm-hmm. This is happening at the same time that politicians are pandering for our votes. And we are the most impacted by the administration's policy. So can you explain what's happening here and how the media is complicit in erasing it?
So first of all, let me just say thank you, Kimberly, for curating this amazing conversation already. I think it's going to be very helpful in this moment. And I want to thank all the folks behind the scenes that are ensuring that I don't cause this whole webinar to crash, given my tendencies. Look, I think it's important for us to understand that there was a kind of standard account of why Donald Trump was elected a second time. And that standard account involved in part a claim about the overreach of identity politics, the overreach of wokeness and the like, right? Mm-hmm. And that then was kind of embodied by Kamala Harris's ascendance to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. And we know that that really wasn't the issue. We know that they were engaged in whatever they engage in. We could call it dog whistle politics, but dog whistle politics no longer exist. They're really very much explicit in this regard. So when we fast forward to the elections in New York and particularly in New York and New Jersey for my purposes, and we see Black voters turning out at the rate that they did, voting how they did. I mean, think about it. Many of us were concerned in New Jersey that the most urban state these Black folk wouldn't turn out in Newark, wouldn't turn out in Patterson, wouldn't turn out in Jersey City, wouldn't turn out in Atlantic City, but they turned out at 94%. But the story was a centrist candidate won. Mm-hmm. Because they have to in some ways lend credibility to the idea that what was really at work in the previous election cycle was the problem of overreach by the Democratic Party with regards to its base. Mm-hmm. When we think about Mamdani, for example, there's this kind he won the majority of Black voters in the election, about 55%, which was a jump of about 20%. I don't know if my numbers are actually all the way accurate now that more data's come in, but that's a jump of about 20% from the primary. But the story was that young voters turned out, and that was the reason why he got elected. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why Black folk vote, according to certain narratives or stories, is because we're committed to identity politics, right? Mm-hmm. We're not committed to a set of policy issues that might affect our day-to-day lives. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be erased from that particular kind of political conversation, but because the way we enter the democratic process is always by way of a certain kind of caricatured understanding of our voting activity. So I think if we look at the data and drill down it, we know that we're a much more complicated electorate than what these folk represent.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question to sort out what part of this is driven by the media's frame that then gets picked up by the political class, and how much the political class is dictating how our voting participation should be framed. The two, we know, clearly reinforce each other, which is a contemporary face of how anti-Blackness is being reproduced and reported in the media and then acted on by political elites. And we want to come back to that. So, Kianga, let me come to you to dig a bit deeper into anti-Blackness as a force driving the attacks on DEI. So, as someone who's explored the structural racism in the housing market, it's notable that the DEI attack has led to the scuttling of the Fair Housing Act, the scuttling of the enforcement. Earlier this year, you wrote in a New Yorker piece about how the assault on DEI lays the groundwork for claims that these and other efforts to assist Black people are expendable because racism doesn't exist in any structural way. So race-conscious measures that equalize opportunity are wasteful. So this is devastating, of course, to the entire infrastructure of civil rights enforcement, but we don't hear our progressive and liberal allies going to the mat to protect these remedies or listing it on the long list of things that we're marching against. So how can we understand this ambivalence, this silence as a feature of anti-Blackness?
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for having me on. I think, there's a couple of things to say about this. And I think a couple of ways to kind of bring this dynamic that you are trying to point out in the report to people's consciousness. And one of the ways that I think about it is how if you use Black people in particular as a scapegoat in different scenarios, that it helps to both normalize and legitimize methods that the right, in particular, in their position of power, want to utilize to help carry out their agenda. So, for example, I think the Trump administration has been committed since returning to power to normalizing and legitimizing the use of the military on the streets of U.S. cities. And so one of the ways that they have both introduced the idea and I think made it palatable for the media is to talk about crime, right? And that we're going to go to Washington, D.C., and we're going to go to Chicago. We're now going to go to New Orleans, all of these cities with big Black populations to deal with the issue of crime. And the image of the quote unquote Black criminal, a familiar one, is a way in which it doesn't really become a huge story for the media. And it also is a familiar enough story for, I think, the American public that it doesn't arouse the kind of response that it should. And I think that this wave of invading cities with the military assisting the police also helped to set the stage for the ICE raids that we have seen. And so I think that this is a kind of historical manifestation in our contemporary politics of the way that anti-Black racism helps to establish a floor for a kind of more generalized political attack to allow that to unfold. And there's, just, I think, one an example of this that is an example of how it has escaped the scrutiny of the media. Do people know what is happening in Memphis right now? Right? Since September, the police, in unison with the National Guard, have arrested over 2,800 mostly Black people in the city of Memphis. They have issued 28,000 citations for traffic violations and other quality of life crimes, right? And so this is the really trying to habituate the public to accepting an illegal role of the military in the domestic policing of the population. Just one quick addition to this has to do then also with the historical and contemporary invocation of the undeserving Black welfare recipient to also get the public to accept cuts to Medicaid, to get the public to accept cuts to food stamps. Now, it remains to be seen, how much people actually accept this, but it's looking at the effort, right, of the Trump boosters on the internet, who really dug into this idea that the problem with food stamps is Black women buying hair extensions with them, buying eyelash extensions with just some of the most crude and disgusting stereotypes in order to get the public to accept the draconian budget cuts that are coming out of the Republican Party. And so this is a tried and true method of really invoking the Black boogeyman to pursue innovations in destructive public policy, or to reinvigorate older methods of destructive public policy, such as with the welfare cuts, that have a tried and true history. And so I think that is a pattern that the Democratic Party used to be much more engaged with. And I think because of Black Lives Matter as a social movement, because of the uprising in 2020, have been more reluctant to engage in those kinds of racial politics in a way that a kind of white supremacist Republican Party has been much more willing to engage with, especially in this second round of the Trump administration.
Yeah. And that asymmetry, of course, that equation is one that just spells disaster. When one side is fully embracing not just dog whistles anymore, that these aren't dog whistles, these
right.
are explicit, right? They're going to the mat on these things. At the same time, the forces of resistance, or at least those who you would look to call that out, are less willing to do it now than they were when it was a dog whistle. So at least it raises the question, is this they're not seeing it? Is it that they don't know the history, behind this? I mean, we know that Reconstruction was taken apart by, framing African Americans as criminal. We know that extrajudicial violence was a feature in suppressing Black political power. We see this page being ripped out of history and replayed again. And we know that the condition of its possibility wasn't just those who were exercising racism to anti-democratic ends, but the party that signed on to it, that allowed it to happen, that didn't want to speak to it, that wanted to get beyond the anti-Blackness in it, in order to rule without the sort of baggage that Black folk represent. So seeing it play out again, it just makes you wonder, what's the story about how this is supposed to work if they can't speak directly to the way that anti-Blackness is playing out? And so on that note, Tim, I guess this is a good time for you to come in, because you have written about how systemic racism can be reproduced from generation to generation, and how this cycle continues even under a post-racial regime. We might call this the post-racial moment. So what examples can you give us that illustrates the constancy, the politics of this anti-Blackness continuously coming back to undermine our democracy?
Well, thanks a lot, Kim. So even before we entered the so-called post-raciality of the Obama years, there were a lot of ways this process had already been sedimented and put in place in a way that neither his administration or any before his could have gotten at, given the tools they were willing and prepared to use. So think about housing, for example, something Kianga's written so powerfully about. Not only did we have generations of obvious anti-Black discrimination in housing, but at the same time, that was happening side by side with massive interventions in the real estate market on behalf of white folks. So preferential FHA policies, interstate highway construction, which lowered the cost of white folks moving to the suburbs where only we could live at that time. And because of those interventions, what happens? Real estate values explode. They triple over a 10 to 15-year period from the late 50s to the early 70s. So once the Fair Housing Act is passed, and although it's now illegal to discriminate based on race, quote unquote, the ostensibly colorblind market can now serve to price Black people out of homes, right? Now they just can't afford to live where the jobs happen to be and where the schools happen to be better funded, right? Now, it's not really a colorblind process, but it seems as though it is to people, and it's sold as that. And the law can't do a lot about it because the law doesn't recognize, quote unquote, societal discrimination or the effects of that as being legally actionable. So even with the election of a Black president, right, absent a targeted intervention, which he was not willing to make, again, because anti-Blackness so baked into the politics that he understood he could not, that means that anti-Blackness, the impact of that gets perpetuated. The same way today, and this goes back to the report that we've released, the ostensibly colorblind decision to gut the civil service in the name of, cutting waste or cutting the size of government, to a lot of people, that probably appears unrelated to anti-Blackness, right? It's just a conservative thing. Conservatives do that. They want to cut the fat or whatever, right? But given the history in which Black folks were kept from significant occupational mobility in the private sector, right, and therefore pushed disproportionately into the public sector, and it's something everyone understands to be true. The right understands it to be true. Students of history know it's true. That means that these kinds of cuts are quite obviously going to have not just an anti-Black impact, but they need to be understood as part of an antipathy to Black people and communities that has animated anti-government rhetoric since at least the 1960s. So essentially the point here is years of systematic bias produce outcomes which then set up Black communities for harm even after the law changes or the faces of people in power change. That bias produces a unique vulnerability for Black folks, which makes it possible for anti-Black bad faith actors like the ones in power now to weaponize color blindness in a way that is profoundly color conscious in actuality.
Yeah. So, at the core of their ability to do this, to sort of wrap a race agenda around color blindness is a wink, wink, and a nod, because they've not given up on their racial explanations. They've not given up on, the association of Blackness with a natural hierarchy that's part of what's behind the Trump administration's framing of the idea that race is socially constructed as an improper ideology. If we think that race is socially constructed, then we understand that hierarchy is as well. Their point is that hierarchy is not constructed, and therefore efforts to dismantle it are themselves preferential treatment, improper, and should be abandoned. So all of these are tangible examples of how anti-Blackness pervades our politics, our policies, and our political analysis. But I imagine that as we move forward, there are those who question the analysis. So it would be important to say what we mean, but also what we don't mean when we're talking about anti-Blackness. And what's important for us to say to separate what we're saying from what gets framed as mere identity politics. So I imagine that there are naysayers who doubt the fundamental claim. And I imagine that, I mean, we know what the MAGA community is thinking. They're on brand. But we're talking about, you know, the folks in our own house, if we want to call progressives and liberals part of the family. And we know that some of them try to distance themselves from anti-Blackness as a legitimate concern. They frame the focus as too divisive. Beyond them, there's the centrists who, and the progressive leftists who may agree with us that our democracy is in structural crisis, but not racial crisis. Race to them is derivative of class at best, if it's acknowledged at all. So how do we speak to the camp that either sees anti-Blackness as too identitarian to be universal, or too distracting from what really is at stake, which they frame as class struggle, of course, separate from the racial components of class. So Kianga, let me come to you first, because you think and write a lot about this.
Yeah, let me say, I think, right, there are two things. One is that I think it's very difficult in this climate to claim that race is inconsequential and has no impact or emphasis or anything to do in this. I mean, Trump every day is a stark reminder for anyone who is trying to talk about something else. I mean, and I don't know if it's, I'm going to go on a rant about Somalia to distract from the fact
come with it. Come with it.
I've pardoned the narco, you know, drug dealer, even as I'm preparing the country to go bomb Venezuela in the name of stopping the flow of drugs. I mean, none of it makes any sense. But the racism that is not just coming from Trump, but have you seen the memes from the Department of Labor? Mm-hmm. Have you seen the memes from the Department of Homeland Security? Have you seen the people that Trump is, nominating for positions of power and authority within his administration? Paul Ingrassia, who is, was nominated for the office of, I can't remember the name of the office, but a White House whistleblower office, who is someone who is really written about his admiration for white supremacists. I mean, so this isn't, I don't even know if we can talk about this administration making gestures towards colorblindness. If anything, it has embraced an agenda of white supremacy. So that's one thing that I think has to be said to anyone who thinks that we can somehow skirt around the issue of racism, anti-Black racism, any kind, xenophobia. All of it is right there at the heart of the Trump administration. And
yet, Kianga, and I want you to go to your other point, but I just wanted to punctuate this. I had the occasion to talk to one of our, progressive TV commentators, and I pointed out that the media, the progressive media, was underreporting Trump's racism, underreporting his condition of possibility. I mean, the very fact that this man who has X number of felony counts against him, X number of failures, X number of that his white maleness is the reason why he is able to be in that position.
It's
we
farce.
Don't talk about that. And his response to me was, well, everybody knows that already. So
No,
the
it's
race
a
and gender
farce.
contours of it are not reportable, is not news, which normalizes, of course, the
Right.
way that race and gender power are playing out.
It is it I've been trying to find the language to talk about this for months because there is something utterly farcical
Mhm.
about an administration full of utterly incompetent people making daily determinations and judgment that it's Black people who are incompetent and who must be driven from the seat of government.
And that
So,
this is not the story.
right,
This is not
right.
the story.
So that's one thing. My other point was one, we can't avoid this. This is at the heart of the Trump administration. But the other point is, I think that there are people on the left who believe that because of the wide scale of attack from the Trump administration, that we have an opportunity to build a wide, broad movement, and that we must find the sort of common denominator that we can all agree upon, and that race politics,
Not that.
DEI, anti-Blackness, that those pull us apart instead of what are the issues that bring us together. And to me, it's a losing strategy on so many levels. But the main one is that in a moment of insane racism, the idea that you can tell Black people to just put that aside and come together for the greater good is insane. The idea that you can tell Latino people to just put the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant politics to the side so that we can find some common denominator is insane. When you have the president calling entire groups of people either cannibals and dog eaters or human garbage or whatever epithet of the day is for whatever entire population of Black or brown people, it is politically insane and destructive to say that we have to find some other issue because the issues that you are confronted with in the immediate right now is too divisive.
Yeah.
See, we can't actually build a movement on that basis. We can only go through it. We cannot tiptoe around it, which means talking about, in this case, when we're talking about anti-Blackness, is talking about the absolute centrality of anti-Black racism to the Trump agenda of getting people to buy into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so, the timelessness of this resistance to going through it rather than going around it. I've heard it recently in conversations with some of our allies who are mobilizing, great work on the street. But when I ask, where's the placard against racism? Where's the concern about how racism is being used as the vehicle to dismantle our democracy? I'm told precisely what you said. That's not an issue that people can agree on, so we can't promote that. And
which then leads to the next question, which is, where are the Black people?
Exactly. And that in turn, leads to, well, is there a common investment in the idea that, well, maybe we can recapture this democracy if we don't have to deal with Black folks, which was one of the bases for the capitulation of the Republicans after Reconstruction to the white Democrats. Like, let's agree not to fight over this, and maybe we can get back to business as usual. And Eddie, this is a good time to bring in your essay, What America, your meditation on Ralph Ellison's essay, What America Would Be Like Without Blacks. I have a similar essay. I go back to Derek Bell's Space Traders, right? Which, you know, he kind of talks about how America is willing to bargain away Black folks for the things that they really want. And in this moment, it might be peace. It might be, you know, the democracy that they thought they had. Both of them utilize thought experiments, right, to help us imagine and see anti-Blackness playing out. Now, they were written decades ago, right? But they could have been written today. So for those who aren't familiar with the deep roots of this fantasy of Black disappearance, Black erasure, help us paint a picture of why this particular embodiment of our erasure is so resilient across time.
It's so much to say here, but it has everything to do with, in my view, the fact of our existence in the United States calls into question the lie of the United States. That is to say, you think about early July 4th celebrations. You think about the July 4th days of 1834 in New York, when Black folk would show up to parades, we would literally physically be attacked. Our very presence revealed the lie that was being celebrated. So America imagines itself at once as a beacon of freedom, but as a practitioner of unfreedom. Imagines itself as a beacon of freedom and as a white republic. So our presence contradicts that self-imagining. And so we have to be erased. We have to be disciplined. We have to be moved from view or from sight, right? And so it seems to, and one way to think about King is extraordinary kind of rendering of the current moment, of the challenges of our politics, is that reality has distorted the very ways in which we participate in democratic politics itself. That it becomes very difficult for Black people to represent the interest of Black people in an interest-based politics, because the assumption is, particularly among the political class in the Democratic Party, is that to explicitly advocate on behalf of Black folks' interest is to activate the racism of the American polity. So you have to translate those interests in a way such that it could be digestible. So even the move to translate it is a concession to the reality of racism defining our political lives in the public domain. But when we think about the history of the country, right, this is from the very beginning. It has everything to do with the tragic choice at the calamitous Annunciation to invoke T.S. Eliot. Right? It has everything to do with the moment in which we made the compromises that make up the very foundational document of the United States. We can see it in these milestone celebrations. 1876, coming out of the bloody Civil War, this moment in which the nation is celebrating 100 years of existence. It has to tell itself a story. And in order to tell itself that story, Black folk have to be redacted. So in order for America to be imagined as a city on the hill, right, it has to either eradicate or erase. And it does it repeatedly. And so Ralph Ellison says in 1970, to go back to your question, in what America would be like without Blacks, he says, whenever the country, right, tires of the work around racial justice, it reaches for the fantasy of secession, of getting shut of the question of Black folk. He writes this, he says, since the beginning of the nation, white Americans have suffered from a deep uncertainty as to who they really are. One of the ways that has been used to simplify the answer has been to seize upon the presence of Black Americans and use them as a marker, a symbol of limits, a metaphor for the outsider. The faces at the bottom of the well, that which we cannot descend to. So there's the materiality of Black life, and then there's the symbolic, right, presence of Black folk and the other that gives meaning and substance to white folk. And that's the beginning of the end of my ramble.
Yeah, well,
Iran.
you know, you're dropping the word. You're dropping the word, and you know, there's so much there as well. I was taken back as you were talking to the acquiescence to the idea that we need to translate our particularities, our history, our right to being citizens, to the famous Philadelphia speech that President Obama gave.
Yes.
Then nominee Obama, and I remember on one hand how much, you know, how much people celebrated the speech, and how it was like, woo, you know, he was able to save his candidacy. What I didn't understand is how people didn't see the small print, and the small print was, this is how Black people have to articulate their interests. You need to tie your interests to other people. You need to stop talking about your history. You need to frame your demands in universal terms, as though we had not already been doing that, right? No. So there were all these things that we had to do. Read to your children, and really nothing that white people had to do, other than understand that some of us were still pretty upset. And when I saw that asymmetry, you know, as being the marker of what this new post-racial moment was about, I started to get worried. And I'm still worried, because for me, the bigger threat that creates the conditions for our disenfranchisement is not necessarily what MAG is doing, because MAG is going to do what MAG is going to do. It's the reaction of the party and the people and the elected officials who rely on us and yet don't defend us.
Right. I mean, Frederick Douglass called them the apostles of forgetfulness.
The apostles of forgetfulness.
Right. And Baldwin wrote about it. It says, you know, in Many Thousands Gone, he's a young man. He says and I'm paraphrasing him here, but the precondition for our entree is that we must make our faces blank in order to wash away your guilt.
Oof.
As the precondition for our entree.
As the precondition. And we saw it and still see it, you know. And
I should say this really quickly, Kim. And it's also the case that if our story is going to be tended to, the story of Black struggle in the United States, it has to be redacted in such a way that it affirms American universality as a beacon of freedom. So if we're going to tell the story in such a way, if America is going to recognize us as a part of it, we have to enter its narrative as an affirmation of it, not as a challenge to it.
It's the condition.
It's the precondition. So Obama's story, right, has to contain a redaction. Otherwise, our story will challenge the myth and the lie.
And my colleague, Sumi Cho, would say, and that is the threat of organized Blackness. That is why the telling of the history requires redaction, right? That is what is behind so much of the erasure of our story. Let me bring Tim back into the conversation. So Tim, you've been writing about how anti-Blackness is distinguishable from white supremacy or even racism, which many people probably would prefer and understand to be more capacious concepts than the way we're talking about anti-Blackness. So, you know, my sense is that at best, some people might want to think of these as synonymous. And if they're synonymous, why do we have to talk about anti-Blackness? So help us understand, that they're not synonymous, but even more importantly, why the departure, the running from the it cannot be said is so damaging to our hopes for recovery, for strengthening, for fighting in this moment.
Well, as somebody who lived in New Orleans for 10 years, I can be forgiven for thinking in culinary metaphors. So let me say that I think anti-Blackness is, to me, the roux and the gumbo of white supremacy, right? It is what forms the base of the thing that we're talking about when we talk about white supremacy. White supremacy has never operated absent anti-Blackness, because anti-Blackness was the basis for the creation of whiteness itself in the colonial era. In terms of its relationship to racism as a generic concept, anti-Blackness is more than just one among many forms of racism. Anti-Blackness literally does different work than racism generically can do. So, for example, Blackness early on deemed the floor beneath which others are not allowed to fall, right? So even others who are demeaned and degraded and discriminated against in any number of ways will not be allowed to fall to the level of Black people. In fact, your distance from Blackness is going to serve as the indicator of whether you are free labor or not, which is to say whether you're fully human in the sense of being able to exercise autonomy, right? So when white folks, disproportionately Irish or German immigrants, burned that orphanage during the beginning of the Civil War draft riots in Midtown Manhattan, what are they saying? They are saying, oh, hell no, we are not going to go fight for these people to be free and equal to us, because their degradation is literally what marks the contours of our humanity. Racism generically cannot do that, but anti-Blackness as a unique marker of unhumanity can. Second, and this is something that the right understands, I think, better than some on the left, organized Blackness, going back to the point you mentioned that Sumi often talks about. Organized Blackness, from the revolts of enslaved persons to the abolitionist struggle to the Reconstruction era Black lawmakers to the civil rights movement, that has been the engine of democratization in this country. Every step forward on the road toward real democracy has been guided by the deliberate and organized efforts of Black people and those allied with Black people, which means if your goal is autocracy, if your goal is fascism, if your goal is some form of corporatist, elite, anti-democratic rule, you have to undermine organized Blackness to get where you want to go. You have to utilize anti-Blackness uniquely in your rhetoric and your policy if you're going to topple the larger structure. So it's like if you think about the game Jenga, right? Another metaphor, not culinary this time, game night metaphor. If you reimagine Jenga as a game where the whole point is to bring the tower down, to collapse the tower. The real game, you're trying not to knock it down. Imagine that Jenga is about knocking the tower down and the tower represents democracy. These folks know that they need to pull out the piece that represents Blackness, organized Blackness, and pull that piece, because that is the key to the larger structure. So that is the way of conceptualizing anti-Blackness, separate and apart from, though obviously part of, racism and white supremacy.
Yeah. And so let me add my critical race theory amen to this entire piece of the conversation with respect to Blackness being the floor. I'll also say Blackness is the thing that is outside of the possibility of becoming part of the political body that is the American state. The famous Dred Scott opinion that decided that because of what was done to us, because of our having been enslaved, because our Blackness was framed as the condition of our enslavement, we became the thing that was done to us. So our enslavability, whether we were slaves or not, was offered as the justification for why Black people could never, ever be citizens, ever. So anti-Blackness becomes the justification for our being knocked out of the possibility of being citizens. Importantly, the moment that we made happen in which the idea of who was an American became a moment when our Blackness became the point of entry for everybody to become American citizens, right? So anti-Blackness in framing us as enslavable becomes a permanent feature of who we are. Our fighting against that becomes a door to which not only do we enter into citizenship, but so does everybody else. So this moment of actually challenging birthright citizens, it's not being talked about as having to do with anti-Blackness, but you can't understand birthright citizenship without understanding the historical fight against anti-Blackness. So you know what, we could go on, but here is a moment where we want to hear about what other people are saying about this conversation. So I'm going to take a moment to step away to hear from our correspondent, Kevin Minofu, for a quick social media break. What are folks talking about online, Kevin?
Well, I'll start with myself, that this is an absolute lesson. I am taking notes. I am learning so much, and just really powerful. And the engagement we're getting both in the chat on Zoom and on YouTube has been very, very robust. I'm going to share a couple of things that folks are responding to. Shirley Murphy from Marietta, Georgia shares that America is yet to be great for so many of us. The struggle continues. 47 wants to take us back to the 1800s. Ella Harris uplifts a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he says that all politics are identity politics, except for the politics of white people. You know, we've got people talking about their personal experiences of what's happening currently right now. And Tesla has shared that, you know, our public school kids in Florida aren't learning accurate history. It's infuriating. I think that's linked to the broader assault on history and this happening. This is not, it's not convenient timing that this is all happening at the same time. Tiffany Johnson highlights the absurdity of anti-Blackness, asking me as a Black woman to ignore blatant racism and misogyny is infuriating. I think joining Kianga's point of the kind of farcical nature of the upside down world we.
I think we lost Kevin for just a moment. There you go.
These convos have occurred, but what you don't understand is that they don't want to have those conversations. They're too uncomfortable. And then I'll end with this quote. You know, it's moving us into the next few rounds. You know, why is it important that we have to continue to make them uncomfortable? And so, what can we continue to do to challenge those people who are afraid of having these conversations and push them to have them? So on both YouTube and Zoom, it's been great engagement so far. We appreciate all of you for joining us this evening. And Kim, I'm going to toss back to you because I know there's still a lot more left.
Thank you. Thank you so much, correspondent. So we want to pick up on some of those questions. First, going a little deeper about why it's so hard to take anti-Blackness seriously, despite its critical foundation to and for the MAGA moment. So I want to go back to the moment, let's say, when January 6th happened. They made it a point when they took over the Capitol with displays that can't be understood outside of the history of anti-Blackness, the Confederate flag, the noose and the gallows, the chants demanding their country back. And it was no secret who they were demanding the country back from, and who were the people that they were indicting for having stolen the election. It was Philadelphia, it was Detroit, it was Atlanta, it was Ruby Freeman, it was Shay Moss. So this is clearly a moment where anyone who's concerned about the attack on our democracy can't possibly look at that and not see the role of racism, and in particular calling out Black people for taking something from them. At the same time, millions of dollars are being poured into parents' rights organizations that attack critical race theory, that attacked the 1619 Project, that turned into a full-scale assault on truth and memory and education. So one of the reasons that anti-Blackness seems to be so effective is that it's not only a tool that the MAGA folks use, but they know that it can discipline the resistance of those outside of their quarters. They know that there is something in what they're saying that has broader appeal. We like to say that this moment is like the horror movie when you realize that the call is coming from inside the house. So I guess what this is bringing me to, Tim, is we've talked about anti-Blackness. We've talked about our allies' inadequate responses to it. What can we point out as the failures of progressive movements to consistently center it, and what the long-term consequences of that omission have been and will be for the pursuit of a multiracial democracy.
Well, despite the uprising in 2020, a lot of the rhetoric, unfortunately, in progressive spaces, both before that uprising and since, from Occupy to the pro-democracy activism in the age of Trump 2.0, has often sidestepped the centrality of race and anti-Blackness to how the class system works, or to how important anti-Blackness and racism is to moving toward a more authoritarian future. And so, coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, we started hearing people once again saying what many have always said: well, we should stop focusing on identity, focus on class, focus on coming together to fight for better healthcare, better schools. The problem is, when we pivot directly to class without centering anti-Blackness, what we miss is that anti-Blackness is one of the main things that makes class-based solidarity so difficult. It is the denigration of Black people that has made it difficult for a lot of white folks to join with folk of color to push for those better wages or that better healthcare. There's plenty of research on this, right? That anti-Blackness is one of the major impediments to larger social safety nets, which are needed by millions of white people. And the reason that it's an impediment is because financial need has been so racialized as Black in the public imagination that white folks will literally do without, just to make sure that no Black person is getting over or taking advantage of some program. So when folks say, well, we should just focus on, the push for universal programs of uplift, what they are missing is that too often, for a lot of white Americans, it is the universal part that they can't handle, that bothers them, right? When government jobs or housing or benefit programs were essentially limited to white folks during the New Deal era, we loved those programs, right? When we made them more accessible to Black folks in the 60s, that's when everybody discovers their inner libertarian and decides that these efforts make you lazy, right? And so then not only do Black folks and other folks of color suffer from the budget cuts in those efforts, but so do millions of white people. So until we challenge anti-Blackness that functions to keep working class white folks in line and make it, that's going to make it harder to sustain progressive coalitions. That is what happened historically in the late 1800s with the Populist Party. That's what weakened the labor movement and really destroyed it in the South in many ways in the 20th century. And it continues, I think, to torpedo our chances for multiracial democracy today.
And then there's the question of its impact on communities, Black communities and others, with respect to their beliefs and their commitments about political participation. So Kianga, you wrote in the New Yorker back in 2020, after Biden defeated Trump, that a failure of the Democratic Party to deliver during a time of unprecedented need would further validate the sense that electoral participation does not matter. So given what has happened since you wrote those words, I suspect we can all see that something needed to happen that didn't happen. So to what extent does a fear of confronting this anti-Blackness hurt progressive coalitions, undermine democratic participation, contribute to the cynicism that you mentioned when it comes to voting?
So I think that one of the things that we have to talk about is, I think the way that Tim described that is very accurate. And so the question is, what do we say about it? And what do we do about it? And I think this is what I'm talking about when I bring up that we have to go through it and that we can't evade the questions of race. And one of the ways that we do that, and particularly anti-Blackness, because I do think that we have to, in some ways, see the treatment of Black people as a paradigm in the United States for how other groups thereafter have been treated, a paradigm for how you undermine the functionality, the provision of public goods and public services, is to link them to the perception that they are going to undeserving Black people. And to me, going through it in ways that I think are loath to either political party because of a similar operating calculus, which is we don't want to spend money to expand the role or function of the state to provide people. To varying degrees, there have been disagreements and debates among the parties about that. But for the last 50 years, there has been much more overlap than there has been in disagreement. Mm-hmm. And so I think overcoming the issues that you have pointed to, that Tim have pointed to, is a political question, which is what do we have to say to people about how do we reach the society that we want to reach, that is good for Black people, that's good for everybody who lives here, that benefits white people, ordinary working class white people who also suffer in very distinct ways, in different ways, but from the inequality that is at the heart of this society. And one of the ways I think of understanding that is to look at the way that racism helps to undermine our system of government, helps to undermine the functioning of our country. If it is that easy for Republicans to simply cut Medicaid and food stamps by saying that, well, these are going to Black people, then you can see the ways that racism not only creates a burden for Black people, but it also creates a problem for white people, millions of white people who also rely on Medicaid, millions of white people who also rely on food stamps. Allowing the Republican Party in particular to continue to whip up the boogeyman of the Black criminal, which then legitimizes the American government spending upwards of $80 billion a year to sustain the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, undermines programs that are essential to the health and livelihood of Black people disproportionately, but also poor and working class white people. And the state and the kind of wealthy and influential have used this strategy literally since the end of slavery to undermine programs, investments in the social public infrastructure of this country for ordinary people across the spectrum, have used Black or racism directed at Black people to undermine that to our detriment and to their benefit. But that's a political argument that the left and the progressive, movement has to take up. And that is how you both reach out to Black communities. And I think what Eddie Glaude said at the beginning of this is important in terms of Zohran Mamdani's campaign. If we're looking for a pivot in what is possible in politics, he faced the challenge, right? The challenge is that he underperformed with Black voters in June. And what that has typically meant in the Democratic Party is that then you go chasing white Republican voters and hope that they will do the impossible, hope that they will do the thing that they have never done, which is somehow decide on election day to come around and vote for you. Instead, he went to the Bronx. he went to Black neighborhoods and dug in and talked about these bread and butter issues, not avoiding race, but bringing those issues into this bigger coalition of the disaffected, the disposable, the excluded, and marginalized. Mm-hmm. And that's a political decision, that's a political strategy, and that's a political argument. Mm-hmm. And so someone wrote in the chat, well, what do we do? That's what we do, right? That is not avoiding race, not ducking race because for the sake of unity, which is an insane idea that makes no sense in the most frontally racist administration since Woodrow Wilson in the early 20th century. That is a strategy for failure. We have to confront it dead on and look at the ways that it has been utilized historically and right now in this very contemporary moment to undermine the livelihood of everyone. Some people are getting it much worse. But at the end of the day, when we have the life expectancy of white women who don't have a college degree has fallen off by 5 years, this does not happen in the developed world, right? And so there is the potential, the possibility of building a coalition across affected groups, but not by avoiding discussions about anti-Black racism.
Yes.
But by taking them head on.
Yeah.
So Eddie, let me bring you in on precisely this question, because Kianga says the question is, what do we do with it? What do we say now? And I think you all have laid out sort of the stark, fork in the road. We know what some of our mainstream politicians have been telling us. We know what the pundits tell us. They, everybody does seem to have an understanding that we are in a backlash situation. Everyone seems to have an understanding that, as our friend Carol Anderson calls it, we are witnessing white rage. Mm-hmm. And we understand that for some, the response to that white rage is to accommodate it, not to activate it, not to throw a red flag in front of it. And so for them, that means not speaking of this, not embracing the values that built the, sort of pro-democracy, multiracial, I think even fairly we could call it a consensus, allowing for pieces of it to be lopped off, allowing for us to be silenced. So that's the one direction. Mm-hmm. And a lot of our allies actually are embracing that. Mm-hmm. And then there's, as you talked about a few weeks ago, the Mondani, sort of approach. So I wonder what more guidance we can give those who have been nodding along in this conversation, who actually identify the things that we're talking about. And then tomorrow they're going right back to progressive spaces. They're going to friends. They're going to people who are deeply concerned about this democratic crisis, but believe that we cannot survive it if we tell the truth about anti-Blackness's role in the center of this.
Well, a couple of things. One, I think Professor Taylor has just given us a kind of blueprint of what we need to do. We have to confront it. We have to go through it if we're going to get to the other side of it. And those of us who've read our Marx, we could hear what she's saying in that moment, right? So that's really important. But I also want to say this: white rage is tethered to sentimentality. And what do I mean by that? Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, that chapter on the Freedmen's Bureau, he talks about the way in which Black folk enter into political debate. We enter as what? Wards of the state, right? Who are wards of the state, right? Think about it. We're not seen as political actors in certain sort of ways. And sentimentality are those crocodile tears. What can we do for the Negro, right? This philanthropic approach to racial justice, that racial justice is a charitable enterprise. And Baldwin says that sentimentality is always the mask for cruelty. Right? So that's all we need to do. Some people think, some people hold the view, that's all that need to do is just simply admit to the fact of racism, and that admission should bring absolution. And when absolution isn't forthcoming, but more demands are forthcoming, then rage is triggered, right? And so part of what we have to do is to tackle the underlying commitment or the underlying view that freedom is the possession of white folks to give and to take away. Mm-hmm. And as long as that is not the possession, that view is not the possession of people who wear hoods or people who are committed to nationalist conservatism or the proud. That view cuts across the political spectrum, that freedom is the possession of some folk to give to others. And so it short circuits the hard work of politics that Professor Taylor has just laid out, because people just want to do something for us, right? As opposed to get about the hard work of racial justice. So part of what we have to do when we go back to our spaces and confront the reality that we are facing a white nationalist agenda in the White House, right? So that we can get to the other side of this, is we have to challenge the people we love, right? The views, right? The view that they hold, right? We're not a charitable enterprise. Racial justice is not a philanthropic gesture. And as long as liberals believe that, and as long as progressives think that they're not doing that, we will find ourselves in this conversation repeatedly.
Again and again. And Tim, we've been given some marching orders, we've been given some aspiration, we've been shown the consequence of not moving forward. You started us off with sort of a culinary analogy. I can't wait to hear what your closing analogy is.
I'm out of them now. I should have a bread pudding analogy, but I don't, or a beignet analogy or something. I don't have one, but I will say this at the risk of being somewhat repetitive with what Kianga and Eddie have both said or alluded to. I think it's really critical to reinforce that idea that moving forward, the idea of anti-racism, the idea of racial justice as a charitable act, as something that we do for these people over here, has to be put away as part of the progressive or liberal repertoire. What that means is embracing, as painful as it is to admit, the truth that Derek Bell articulated so many years ago and that so many in critical race theory have articulated, which is that, it isn't usually out of the goodness of white folks' hearts that things have changed when they have changed. When they have changed, it has always and only been in those moments of interest convergence. Now, there are a lot of liberals who have a hard time hearing that because they want to believe that we should do it for the right reason. We should do it because racism is morally an abomination. Well, it of course should be done for that reason. And yet there's no evidence in history of that happening, which means we have to identify those moments and issues of interest convergence in the modern era. Let me just mention one that I think we can articulate. Here we are still in the midst of the COVID crisis. I know we say we're not, we think we're not, but there's still people getting sick, suffering from long COVID, still dying, in fact. And anti-Blackness is central to understanding why we are the epicenter of failure on the planet with this crisis, because it was April 7th of 2020, less than a month in, when the front page headlines announced what? That the disproportionate death was Black folk, and particularly in places like New York City. And within 10 to 12 days, white folks start showing up at state capitals with camouflage and semi-automatic weapons, demanding the right to go back to Buffalo Wild Wings, get their hair cut, go bowling, play mini golf, whatever it is we wanted to do, because by God, don't tell me I got to wear a mask or stand 6 feet away from you at the Trader Joe's, because that's tyranny. And so white folks hear that Black folks are the ones dying and decide to put to take the foot off the brake, right? And I'm sure if that headline in the New York Times had said, I don't know what it is about COVID, but it's killing a lot of white folks would not have been demanding the right to open everything up. They would have said, send me checks, send me checks, send me checks. So the irony is what happens. In April of 2020, CDC data says only 28% of those dying every month were white. after white folks hear it's black folks doing the disproportionate dying and let up on precautions, 1 year later, 62% of the monthly dead, according to the CDC, were white, which means what? White folks buried our parents, our grandparents, our friends, in some cases, children, neighbors, people we love, because we didn't value Black life enough. This is what people meant during 2020 when they said, until Black life matters, nobody's lives are safe. If we can articulate that kind of principle, the idea that Black life and Black freedom and Black liberty are central to all life, all liberty, and all freedom, we have a chance. If we don't do it, we have none.
Well, y'all, this has been a sermon and a lesson. It's been an evening of analysis, of amplification, and of accuracy. So we spent this time, we wanted to spend this time showing the anti-Blackness isn't a side issue, it's not a left-right issue. It's not an issue that we can afford not to address. It is the operating system of this moment. It is the condition of the possibility of the destruction of this democracy. So if anti-Blackness is an organizing principle in this moment, then we have to organize around it. We cannot organize around something that we are unwilling to name. So that's why I want to invite you all to actively use this frame, use it in your everyday life, wherever you show up, at your workplace, your church, your campus, your school, board meetings. And we have resources, including talking points and infographics and videos to help link your conversations with what you've seen in the chat and what you've heard tonight. When we call anti-Blackness by its name, we can confront it. So your call to action can appear in social media. Help spread the word about anti-Blackness. Use the hashtag anti-Blackness is the point to actively highlight how it shapes current events and policies, especially when mainstream media choose to ignore it. So take it home with you. Let it function like a smoke alarm. When anti-Blackness goes out, get up, say something. There's a fire somewhere. On behalf of AAPF, I want to deeply thank our brilliant panelists, Tim Weiss, Kianga Yamada Taylor, Eddie Glau Jr., for helping us see this moment with clarity and speaking to it with courage. Thank you for refusing silence, for showing up, and for committing to fight for a democracy that's big enough and bold enough to center Black freedom. Now, before we close, I want to ask everyone, please, please, please fill out our post-event survey that's being dropped in the chat right now. We want to know, is this the kind of conversation that you value? Is this the kind of information that you need? How does it advance your freedom struggle? And now, I want to say one more thing about our Say Her Name anniversary, Bridges and Gatherings, next Monday at the Atlantic Theater in Chelsea from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. For 11 years, AAPF and the Say Her Name Mothers Network have brought visibility and justice to Black women, girls, and femmes taken by state violence. This evening is going to be hosted by Tony Award winner Kara Young. It is part of art, part of artivism, part of a healing ritual, and it's centered on a stage reading of Say Her Name, The Lives That Should Have Been. This is a piece that was drawn from interviews with members of the Say Her Name Mothers Network. You'll hear it brought to life by an incredible 15-member cast of film, television, and stage actors, including DeWanda Wise, Adrienne Moore, Tanya Pinkins, and many more. And then the conversation will be closed out that night with a talk back with myself and the mother. So seats are going fast. Please don't wait. Scan the QR code on your screen. Choose an option that works best for you, from general admission to packages with reserved priority seating, a signed copy of Say Her Name book, merch, and access to the reception. We hope to see you there. If you're interested and have some questions, we'll host a brief breakout room right after this webinar where AAPF staff will be available to talk more about this topic, about the anniversary. So you'll see the breakout link at the bottom of your Zoom screen at the end. And if you're watching on YouTube, you're welcome to hop over to Zoom and join us there. Lastly, yesterday was Giving Tuesday, but the need to sustain the vital work of racial justice organizations like AAPF doesn't begin, nor does it end on a single day. If you're able, we invite you to make a contribution. Your support helps us push back against censorship, equip teachers, librarians, organizers to sustain the work like the Anti-Blackness Is the Point report and gatherings like this. Nothing is possible without you. So please follow the QR code for more information. So thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing those of you who can on December 8th. Thank you for standing with us and being part of this conversation. Stick around for those interested in hearing more. Thank you so much for joining us.